All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning. If you're on the West Coast, I guess, or in Hawaii. My name is Matt Hardy. I'm the Program Director for Planning and Performance Management here at AASHTO. And I want to welcome everybody to the 30th webinar in our webinar series that has been running for the past 5 years. These webinars are jointly sponsored by both AASHTO and Federal Highway Administration, FHWA. My good friend Steve Gay over there. So I want to thank him for helping to fund these webinars. I think they've been useful, or I hope they've been useful for everybody. Today's webinar is kind of a unique one, or a little bit different. It's more of a very much focused on a current sort of technical issue that all of the states are dealing with when it comes to developing their asset management plans. We're going to have an opportunity for a Q&A so that you guys can ask questions of the FHWA folks. Please, if you have those questions and everything, you can type them into the Q&A functionality within GoToWebinar. And I think Perry at the end, we're also going to say that if you have any follow-on questions, you can send those to me, Matt Hardy, mhardy@ashto.org. And I will consolidate those and sort of put together a list and send them over to Steve to be answered. And then once we get answers, he'll probably post them online, and I can send them out to everybody who's signed up for the webinar. So today's webinar covers what we're calling the sort of priority TAMP requirements that all states must address with their initial TAMPs, and they are due April 30th. I think in one of the emails that I sent out, I mistyped and I put a 2 instead of a 3. I apologize for that. Lots of you pointed that out, so I'm thankful for that. But I don't just to make sure everybody knows they're still due April 30th as opposed to April 20th. At the AASHTO TAM Subcommittee meeting at the TRB Annual Meeting in January of this year, the members, the subcommittee members had requested this type of webinar, and we're glad to be able to make it happen today. Our previous webinar was the 4th installment of our 4-part TAM webinar mini-series, Elements of a Transportation Asset Management Plan. It was focused on understanding the federal requirements that guide TAMP development. That final webinar addressed asset management process improvements, and I recommend looking it up on the AASHTO TAM portal, where you will also find archives of previous webinars and links to videos and slides from today's webinar, which will be posted to that website soon. And that website, you can go to tam-portal.com, and that's tam-portal.com. From there, you click on TAM events in the main menu to find recordings of past webinars, and also to register for any upcoming webinars. We also have a landing page for all of our sort of performance management portals that we have. You can go to transportation management, all one word, .us. From that landing page, you can get to the asset management portal, you can get to the performance management portal, and you can get to the risk management portal that we are starting to develop. So that's sort of three-legged stool when it comes to transportation management. As always, if you have any suggestions on future webinar topics or have questions for the presenters during today's webinar, please submit them using the Q&A functionality on the control panel. If later on you have an idea or something comes into your head about a good topic, you can always email me, mhardy@ashto.org. You can also email Steve Gay over at FHWA, and we can sort of put them on our list. We are always looking for good topics for future webinars. We are always looking for people to present. So if you think that your state or your agency, if we have locals on here, or MPOs or whatever, have good ideas, examples, experiences to share, please let us know that as well, because even though we might have a great topic, if we don't have anybody to sort of talk about it, to share something with, it's very hard to have that webinar. We are going to try to answer your questions as best we can. And again, use that Q&A functionality, type in your questions. We can't unmute all the lines, because if we do that for all the attendees, I guarantee you that we're going to have some background music and somebody's going to be at an airport and all that other great stuff. So the best way to do it is through the Q&A. on the GoToWebinar control panel. We have planned for extra Q&A time today, so again, don't feel shy or anything about asking a question. As I say when I teach classes, there's never a bad question. It just might be one that you don't have the answer to. But we're here and we are happy to help try to answer as many of those questions as we can. And again, later on, if something comes in, if there's a question you have, feel free to contact any of the panelists, myself, and we will try to get those answered for you as best we can. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Steve Gay from the Federal Highway Administration, who will give a brief welcome, and our other co-sponsor for this from FHWA. So Steve, all yours.
Thank you, Matt. FHWA, in cooperation with AASHTO, is very pleased to sponsor this valuable webinar series. We've reached a milestone. This is our 30th webinar. We've come a long way, and we're looking forward to having many more of these in the future. This series is first and foremost an opportunity to share practical, useful, timely information with the asset management community. Today, we're focusing on Priority TAMP Requirements. This is certainly a timely session. Initial TAMPs are due in just a little over 2 months, on April 30th, as Matt said. As I'll be delivering the first presentation on today's agenda, I'll cut short my introduction here. I think you're going to enjoy today's presentations in discussion forum. I'm certainly looking forward to it. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jana Pak of Spy Pond Partners to quickly provide an overview of today's webinar, review our agenda, and introduce our speakers. Jana?
Thanks, Steve. So today's presentation focuses on 3 priority TAMP requirements. These were identified by the AASHTO TAM Subcommittee during the recent TRB Annual Meeting in January. So the 3 topics that group identified were TAMP certification, the 1/10 mile pavement section reporting requirements, and the assets repeatedly requiring repair requirements of the TAMP. We'll hear both the federal and state perspectives on these topics before opening it up to the Q&A forum via the webinar Q&A control panel. Now, the purpose of the webinar series is to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge with the asset management community. We're hoping you'll find today's interactive format for this webinar of value to you. And so again, just as was mentioned before, we really hope that you get your typing on and ask your questions. So the primary learning objectives for this webinar are, first, building working knowledge of key concepts and definitions relevant to the 3 priority pavement permit and the assets repeatedly requiring repair. And then understanding specific federal requirements in these 3 areas, understanding how to apply this knowledge in order to develop an asset management plan that meets federal requirements. And of course, we always strive to share lessons learned, ideas, and knowledge. For the agenda today, I'll introduce our speakers before each presentation, but in brief, we'll start with our first presentation from Steve Gay from Federal Highways, and he's going to share with us an overview on the TAM certification process. Next, we're going to discuss the 10th mile pavement section reporting, and we'll start that with Ed Block from the Connecticut DOT, and he will share the approach they have taken, and then followed by Max Grogg from Federal Highways, who will also discuss that topic. Then our final presentation will be from Greg Wolf of Federal Highways on assets repeatedly requiring repair. And then we'll open it up for Q&A. Just another reminder, please submit your comments or questions using the webinar's Q&A feature on the menu bar on your screen anytime during today's presentation. And in response to the most frequently asked questions, we'll make the slides and the video of today's webinar available on the tam-portal.com. And if you go through the AASHTO website, you can get to it as well. Our first presentation today is from Steve Gay. Steve is Federal Highways Asset Management Team Leader. We've already had a chance to hear from Steve today, so with no further ado, I'm going to turn it right back over to Steve to discuss TAMP certification. Steve, are you on mute?
You know, I'm here, but I think something happened with my screen that shouldn't have happened, but let's see. Okay, no, one moment. Very well. Okay. I'm going to focus on a couple of key items with certification. I think I'm going to generally focus on be sure everybody understands how Federal Highway is going to be doing the certification and what are the key items. But I'm going to start out with just some background information so that states, division, others are all starting from the same point. But bottom line is, at the end of the day, Federal Highway has put quite a bit of effort into having uniformity and consistency between our division offices and how we do the certification. We all know the background information that every state DOT is to develop an asset management plan to improve or preserve the condition of the assets, must address pavements and bridges on the NHS, and states are encouraged to include other assets. Key dates, and I want to focus on a couple of these in particular. Initial asset management plans, as mentioned earlier, are April 30th. State DOTs, when you send over the official copy for review, and it's certainly recommended that as it's being developed, the division offices see drafts, etc., address any major issues, but a Federal Highway Division office has 90 days to review it. A key date, November 20th. Because of the way MAP 21 was written, it's a transition period, and it focuses on the state DOT developing and implementing an asset management plan consistent with 23 USC 119 and Part 515 and setting targets for NHS pavements and bridges. We realize that the initial plan is due on April 30th. State DOT have their target set by October 1st, no problem. But I'm locking in on the words there, has the state developed and implemented their asset management plan? I think I can assume there may be a few that do, but the majority of states will not have developed and implemented the asset management plan by November 20th, 2018. We are in the process of developing a guidance memo for our Federal Highway Division office with expectations of, if the state basically has shown a good faith effort, they have the initial processes certified, they're working on the TAMP, they have the state target, that they can ask for an extension. And the memo will get into that, into further detail of just what that all means. The first complete asset management plan is due on June 30th, 2019. And at the same time, Federal Highways will have done the first consistency review. That's a consistency review of the investment strategies in the initial asset management plan by August 31st, 2019. Internally, the division officers will be the ones certifying the asset management processes. We have set up a team of the Resource Center, led by Lisa Rando, that can assist the division officers. And we should have SharePoint site internally for federal highway use only, just so we can track where we are with the TAMPs being submitted, the certification, etc. This is our way in headquarters to basically know what's happening out there. The asset management plan, we all know what the requirements are, and I'm going to talk a little bit about these, one or two of these specifically as examples in a moment. We know the initial asset management plan must address all those items, but they do not need to include the analysis for the life cycle planning, risk management, and financial plan. And they do not have to have what I'll call the PM2 targets in the initial plan, but they still must describe the processes. So states must describe all the processes, but they don't need the items including here. For additional information, we have posted Q&As, the certification guidelines that I'll be talking about in a few minutes. What was published in the Federal Register is available on the FHWA Asset Management website. We're in the process of updating them. Realistically, I hope they're updated within the next week or so. There'll be notification in the Federal Register, and I'll also be letting the divisions and others know when they are updated. But like I said in the past, you can certainly use the ones up there. You're going to understand why in a moment. Why are federal highways reviewing and certifying the initial TAMPs? One, we're required to certify the TAMP processes. We're evaluating completeness of the initial plan. In other words, are there gaps of what's needed to have the first complete TAMP that's due in June 2019? And the results of both of these are relevant in the future, as I indicated earlier, with the November date and the August date coming up. Please go to the FHWA Asset Management website. You have questions and answers on initial TAMPs, certification guidelines, just general questions on asset management plans. There's also guidance documents there for life cycle planning, risk, financial planning, and so forth. When a state DOT develops and submits their initial TAMP, there's three things that can happen. Processes are certified, they can be conditionally certified with minor corrections, or they can be denial. The key point I want to make in this presentation is you've seen the guidelines that are available on the FHWA website that were published in the Federal Register. Pay particular attention to the required element section. It may look like that or here, but the bottom line issue is Federal Highway Division officers will be going through each of those required elements and basically saying, has it been met, or it has not been met, or needs clarification. So the way FHWA division officers will be doing the certification is they'll be using those certification guidelines and going down through this list of required elements, each bullet. And each bullet needs to be a yes. I want to call it a checklist, but it's a little more than that, seeing that you could certainly expect comments, etc. So as I refer to process, that goes back to what I listed earlier, the processes. There's examples there, but the item that we're Federal Highway Division officers are focusing on is that required element in each bullet. For example, again, just a little more comprehensively, if you look at the performance gap analysis, you see the 3 bullets that are there for required elements for physical condition, and you see the couple bullets there on effectiveness in the performance of the network. To make it very clear again where this came from, if you go back to 23 CFR 515, it's almost a cut and paste of the required elements into your certification guidelines. That's where this is all from. There's nothing new. A couple of these that I want to highlight in addition to understanding the bullet items there. State DOTs should describe in the asset management plan of how they obtain necessary data from other NHS owners or how they collaborated and coordinated. I know I've had a question a few weeks ago, and it seemed to be that they focused on pavement data. No, we're talking about all sort of data. Pavement data, bridge data is applicable, or even the discussion dealing with risk, financial data, etc. Please indicate in the asset management plan your process or how you coordinated with other NHS owners. Another item that you'll see on the certification guideline list is some discussion on the data and the analyses, but also I'm looking at the very last bullet here is looking at the STIP. And it means that the STIP is used as background information, but it's not a substitute for carrying out the required analyses. For example, don't say, we did investment strategies and start listing a bunch of projects that came from the STIP. That's background information. At the end of the day, you go through the analyses of the performance, condition, life cycle planning, risk, financial plan to develop the investment strategies with a relative respective analyses, etc., using your pave and bridge management systems. Again, there's plenty of resources available. NHI training courses, like I've mentioned in the past, if you like the NHI training but you don't have funding for it, don't hesitate to contact me. We also have asset management workshops similar to the ones that were held in Cambridge, Raleigh, Kansas City, and Phoenix that focus on life cycle planning, risk, and financial planning. Just let me know if you would like it presented in your state. There's no cost. Simply provide the facility and bring the people. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact any of us. Thank you so much, and back to you, Yana.
Thanks, Steve. So our next presentation is going to be about the 10th mile pavement section reporting, and we're going to have 2 speakers on this part. And so first we'll have Ed Block from Connecticut DOT with a presentation, followed by Max Brogg from Federal Highways with comments. So I'm going to introduce Ed first. He's the outgoing chair of TRB's Standing Committee on Pavement Management System. I think he's still currently the chair. And since 2015 has led the Performance Management Unit at Connecticut DOT. Ed has worked in the pavement management, evaluation, and design arena for 28 years, mostly at Connecticut DOT, but also at a private toll authority in Argentina and in consulting engagements in the U.S. Ed is coordinating Connecticut DOT's performance management implementation effort, including MAP 21 FAST Act compliance, and has worked on developing target setting methodology for the MAP 21 pavement performance measures. And now I'll turn it over to Ed.
Thank you, Gianna. Good afternoon or morning, everybody. Even though the title says 10th of a mile reporting, I think we've been doing 10th of a mile reporting in the HPMS for a number of years now, since the program reassessment that became effective in 2013. So my presentation is not about the number crunching to get those numbers. It's about using them or them being reflected in the target setting that we're going to be doing for the TAMP. So it is a very brief overview that I'm trying to say that we take actions and then we're being measured on the outcomes, and that's kind of a theme throughout this thing. And the outline is centered around some questions and then how we answer them in Connecticut. At what scale do we invest in pavement? And scale is a recurrent theme. At what scale do we predict performance in terms of the MAP 21 measures? And at what scale do we report performance? And that's a given. It's the HVMS Field Manual Guidelines, 0.10 miles. Then I'll go over some target setting guiding principles that apply to us, so you can develop your own. And then, how we got to where we are today. And a disclaimer: I'm trying to draw general observations and not tie down. This is what Connecticut is actually doing in their TAMP, because they're still finalizing it. So at what scale do we invest in pavement? So we set goals and conduct strategic analysis at the network and program level, but eventually we take actions in projects or analysis units or sections, and those terms I'll use interchangeably later. And typically, at least in Connecticut, it's from half a mile to about 5 miles, centerline miles of road, and it varies by state, obviously. And that's not likely to change to a tenth of a mile basis like we're reporting on, because if you did that, user delays I expect in mobilization costs would just dwarf any efficiency gains in targeting conditions at that granularity. And it would be a mildly interesting exercise in computing the efficiency gain from finer granularity, but you could do some of that with spot deficiencies versus doing a whole treatment. But it's probably more practical to explore targeting treatments across lanes than along the road. And this is all worthwhile investigating, but we are under a tight deadline of May 20th. So if you haven't started on this tech yet, it's probably a little bit too late. The next question is, at what scale do we predict performance in terms of measures? So we take actions and then we expect them to have a certain performance in order to optimize our investments. So if you predict performance at the network level for target setting for the MAP 21 measures, you need to have a lot of confidence that the program can deliver what you're saying it will into the future. And you probably need a lot of past observations relating those network outcomes in terms of your condition index with the breakdowns of condition that you're going to see when you calculate things according to the MAP 21 rules. And you probably need to be aware that when there's a secular change, new treatments, policies, those relationships are likely to have to be revised. So this takes you down one road, and the next one is, if you do it at the project section levels, this is how most pavement management systems do it. It's set up with analysis units, and the issue here is you still got tenths of a mile sections, so you have an aggregation issue when you project performance for the whole segment. I'll go into that in the case study. And if you do it at the tenth of a mile level, then you need to be able to reflect the investments that are made at another level, at the section level. So your goals set at the strategic or network level, but you're actually carrying out a list of projects, and they happen at the section level, but you need to report what happens at the tenth of a mile level at the MAP 21, and that needs to be tied together to have meaningful and achievable targets. So you need to probably take, and I'm saying probably because hasn't been time to do a peer-reviewed paper on this, but probably you need to fix your pavement management derived program and apply it to a list of segments at tenth of a mile. And what is the performance measurement interval? So it's HVMS basis, tenth of a mile, or sometimes less, and it will capture performance variability that is not captured in a measurement that is aggregated over the analysis units. So you'll have within segment variability. And the key question is, how do we set performance targets that are accurately reflected in the measurements that we report every year through the HVMS? So the next thing is how we went about what I think are good practices to follow in developing a sustainable methodology for target setting, one that you can explain later and that you can follow through and see whether you achieve or not. One of them is that the Transportation Asset Management Plan, the TAMP, is a basis for pavement investment. It uses a pavement management system, uses an appropriate time horizon for pavement strategy development, which is probably a lot longer. It's a minimum 10 years, but it's a lot longer than the performance period that we're setting targets for. And it takes into account cross-asset resource allocation and constraints in one form or another. And then performance becomes a reflection, outcome of your TAMP implementation. So that's principle one. The second one, at least for Connecticut, is that, and I think this is true almost everywhere I've been in the United States anyway, that pavement investments are made at the section or project level. And that reflects current and probably future agency practice. Investing at 1/10 of a mile is not realistic, and investment needs at the program scale are invariably converted to a list of projects to take those actions on the ground. The PMS uses project level investments to optimize network outcomes. The third principle is that investments during the performance period need to reflect reality, and that has to do with the 4-year horizon that we have on those. And that needs to reflect the likelihood of those projects being completed. So performance will reflect actual projects being done within performance period, and a significant portion of the program that will affect conditions over the performance period is probably in the delivery pipeline already, in particular capital program and rehab projects. But also, and this is something that it's good to take into account in the target setting, is that you need to reflect projects that do not follow the best practice pavement management rules, meaning worst first or band-aid treatments that are applied on our networks. In Connecticut, we've developed a treatment to simulate that, and we can apply it to any segment. Fourth principle is that the state DOT should be able to measure performance at the reporting interval, that means a 1/10 of a mile, and explain it in terms of its actions, so tying back the line of sight between actions and performance. So this should make the progress determination discussion about performance as much as possible, and as little about explaining why we didn't meet our target one way or another, whether we exceeded it by a lot or didn't come close to it, so that our progress determination should not be about explaining that in as much as we can control. And the fifth principle is that we need to keep accounting of actions. So things are likely to vary from the expected value of future performance. And if you do this, it'll help explain variation due to the execution of projects that were not planned and variation due to cancellation of projects that were planned within the performance period. So onto our case study. It's a state DOT. This is for the disclaimer that it's for state agency. We had a recent change in collection equipment, so it changed all the measurement technology and resulted in not being able to use a lot of historical data. And we do have a PMS. There is a PMS available to the state DOT, and its capabilities that it can project performance in a set of analysis units or sections or however you use them in your PMS, and it's deterministic. Investments are made at the project level, and then there is a difficulty in applying multiple fixed treatments to a section in the analysis. So if I want to program 2 or 3 subsequent treatments to the same segment without optimizing, that is not that easy. And the variable or optimizable investment strategy, the part of it that's not fixed because it's already in the pipeline and it's going to be reflected in the performance, needs to be applied at the project level but reflected at the 1/10 of a mile level. So here are the main tasks, and I'm going to go through these one by one. Get the correct project list for the 4 years. Predict performance for each of the pavement metrics. Calculate the measures. And use this information to set targets. Sounds very simple. And then cross your fingers that everything that's not under your control helps you in achieving them. So the first task, predict performance for each of the pavement metrics, is done at the section level. We have to do it in terms of the MAP 21 metrics. In our case, we used available data in pavement families at the section level to develop these performance curves that we could use for prediction. Calculate the predicted pavement measures. This is just a shortcut that we used here to combine good, fair, and poor. Hopefully it helps you as you're finalizing that. Assign numbers to have just one comparison test. So there's only so many combinations that you can have for good, fair, and poor, and good, fair, and poor. And if you do this and you multiply these numbers, all goods are 1 billion, and all poor cannot be more than 100, so less than 10,000, and all fair is everything in between. So you can use one comparison test. If that saves you a half a day, then that's why I put it in the slide. And then you need to convert section level predictions to tenth of a mile predictions. And then here you have to deal with the aggregation problem. And in its more general form, I quote a 1976 paper that says it can be defined as the information loss which occurs in the substitution of aggregate or micro level data for individual or micro level data. So how does it play out in pavement? So again, this is kind of repeating the same concept through the presentation, that we make investments in sections that are significantly larger than the performance reporting interval. And PMSs are set up to predict performance at the section level. So you can incorporate new indices, which we did for the MAP 21 distresses, calculate future values through the curves, and store results in a database. But it is not easy to carry out performance prediction at the reporting interval, at least with our current setup, because you end up with way too many sections for our IT capability in order to optimize that. Plus, the variable part, the optimizable part, it's probably not realistic to optimize at the tenth of a mile level. So what's lost within segment variability? The classic case is you have a mile section with tenth of a mile sections that are in good condition. Overall, it's good. And then you have one that has a couple of fair sections and it's still good. But the differences in length when you report it out of the tenth of a mile could be significant. And this increases as you go down the condition scale. So for a fair pavement, you could have things that are very uniform, or some that are just borderline fair, and then some that are very spot conditions that cause you to be at fair, and then your results are very different too. So how do you address that? So the first thing we did was assign a good fair distribution within a segment based on measurements of similar in-place pavement sections. Used a lookup table for measured data. And we use surface age, pavement type, and functional class, and I'll show you that in the next table. But that family definition should be what is relevant to each state agency. So here's one for flexible pavement that happens to be in good condition. And then if you look at the age, you have a length distribution. So you apply that once you have your prediction with the surface age at that time, and then you divvy up the length among good, fair, and poor. And here's one for fair, just to show you an example. The issues is finding sufficient data to reliably assign these condition distribution to the tenth of a mile segments. So using measured data without filtering, you can lead to slightly, sometimes expected percent poor for higher investments, more money, if you don't have enough data. So that could happen. And then there is also the issue that you're introducing here, some kind of probabilistic approach that you would rather just measure and take into account, and not introduce this other uncertainty variable. So the next generation solution is try to avoid having to assign this to estimate. It did work, it does work, but you're likely to under or overestimate. There's just a sampling error there. And expand the PMS capability to conduct strategic analysis using actions and analysis units, and have those actions be automatically reflected in 10-mile segments without having to optimize. So take the list of projects and apply as a fixed program to the tenth of mile segments, group into those same families, and then you can apply the treatment resets and then get all the calculated MAP 21 measures over time, combine them, and then weight them by lane miles. It's not exactly trivial, but it's not that hard. Kind of have to, in our case, we had to do it by hand, and then use this information to set your targets, and then cross your fingers after you've done your due diligence. So as a summary, if you're projecting performance, if you're at the program level, you need to have good data to establish that relationship, I believe. If you do it at the project level, you need an accurate reflection of investments, and then you need to solve that aggregation problem. And if you project performance at the tenth of a mile level, then you need to be able to take those projects from a strategic analysis at the segment level and then apply them to the tenth of a mile level to capture all that variability. And then in common, as a reiteration, get the correct list of projects over the performance period. And that's all I have, and I hope I didn't take too much time from the presentation. So thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Ed. That was a fantastic presentation. Okay, so now we'll be joined for some further discussion of the 10th mile pavement section reporting by Max Grog. Max has worked with the Federal Highway Administration for over 30 years in various locations and positions. He's currently the Pavement Performance and Implementation Engineer in FHWA's Office of Infrastructure. His main duties involve improving pavement performance data in the HPMS and assisting states with performance management, pavement management, and asset management. Previously, Max was the program delivery team leader in the Iowa division for federal highways. Max has worked with various state highway agencies across the country on pavement design, construction, maintenance, and management issues, destructive and non-destructive testing technologies, and the use of life cycle cost analysis. Max has also been involved in the development and instruction of various pavement training courses. So, okay, welcome, Max.
Thanks. And I really want to thank Ed for the presentation. I think he did an excellent job of kind of framing some of the problems, and I just want to hit a few high points. So the one thing I want to hit on first is, as Ed mentioned, this is the 10th of a mile section is not new. This was not something that was just created as part of the pavement performance. This goes back quite a few years. It probably is going to be enforced a lot more closely as the pavement performance regulation came about, and it's a compromise between detail and data storage. And during the rulemaking process, we did look at the 10th of a mile sections. We looked at various options there or whatever, and essentially the 10th of a mile is a good compromise between detail. You know, you get, as Ed showed in his example there, you start seeing some individual good and poor sections. As the sections become longer and longer, what you really start reporting is just the average values, and so everything becomes fair on your network based on those average values. Pavement management sections, you know, those have developed over time through history. They were based on the original construction uniformity. There's some contracting based upon what states do, and those vary. When we looked around the country, you know, anywhere from states are using uniform half-mile sections to variable lengths that are up to 12 miles long. And so that's something that states are kind of invested in. But when we're looking at this from a performance management, or when you're looking at this and how it fits into your asset management, there's a couple key points I want to pass along. And the one is there is no requirement that state DOTs perform the pavement management analysis or program projects in 10th of a mile sections. That's not our expectation. We don't expect you to let a contract to go out and do a 520-foot long overlay just so you can get rid of a 10th of a mile section that's poor. Nor do we expect you to program a 20-mile overlay so that you can get rid of 1/10 of a mile section that's poor. You know, as Ed pointed out in the target setting, you know, this is a process the state needs to go through and look at as part of their asset management process, their whole system. What is their definition of the state of good repair? What is their public's expectation of how much poor they're willing to tolerate, or how much poor they have to tolerate based on the financial situation of that particular state? I think there's a couple things that do fit into this, though, that as states are considering this. One is what I call the cell phone syndrome. I mean, everyone who drives down the road today has a cell phone. And when they hit a pothole, they feel that it is their right to pick up that phone and call the DOT or call the governor or call their state legislature. So, you know, we're all aware of that in the environment that we live in. I think the other thing is maintenance. I think some of these 10th of a mile sections that show up as poor, there may be a discussion that the pavement management system wants to have with the maintenance management system, or with the maintenance managers in that particular state, of looking at that. Is there a maintenance project that could take place to remedy some of these? The last thing I want to mention, and Ed kind of alluded to this at the beginning, and I think it's important to, when you're looking at these pavement management sections and the fact that we program in these, you know, this has been a standard practice. But I think this is an opportunity. I've talked with a couple states that are going back and taking a look at some of those pavement management sections that they've historically had for 5 or 10 or 12 or 15 years. And maybe it's time to reshuffle those. Are those really uniform in traffic? Are they uniform in soil conditions? Are they uniform in the superficial conditions of the pavement or the structural response of the pavement? And so it may be, as we're getting into performance management and asset management, it may be a better way to optimize our approach, a better way to invest our money if we take a look at what those sections are. And again, I'm not saying make them 10th of a mile long, but maybe we just need to reshuffle. Maybe that 12-mile section that we had needs to be 2 1-mile sections and a 10-mile section. So that's what I had. So I'll turn it back to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Max. Our next presentation is from Greg Wolf of Federal Highways. Since 2004, Greg has been the Emergency Relief Program Manager with Federal Highways Office of Program Administration and Headquarters. As the Emergency Relief Program Manager, Greg has been instrumental in developing policy and guidance on the Emergency Relief Program and working with Congressional Appropriations staff on legislation to provide supplemental appropriations to fund nationwide emergency needs following large-scale disasters. Prior to his headquarters assignment, Greg worked in the Federal Highway Maryland Division Office as the Safety Program Engineer and as an Area Engineer in the Office of Highway Safety as a Safety Program Engineer. So I will now turn it over to Greg.
Thanks, Yana. So as you know, MAP 21 included a requirement for rulemaking that would require states to conduct periodic evaluations of facilities repeatedly damaged by emergency events. And that requirement is carried out under 23 CFR Part 667. Part 667 regulation requires state DOTs to conduct statewide evaluations to determine if there are reasonable alternatives to roads, highways, and bridges that have required repair and reconstruction activities on 2 or more occasions due to emergency events. And repair and reconstruction includes permanent repairs but excludes emergency repairs. So that terminology is included in the regulation. That's taken from the emergency relief regulation that defines emergency, actually defines emergency repairs in the statute, but permanent repairs would include repairs such as restoring the pavement surface, reconstructing damaged facilities, and replacing highway appurtenances. It's repair that's permanently bringing that roadway back to its pre-disaster condition. The emergency repairs are repairs such as minimizing extent of damage to the roadway or restoring essential traffic. It could be repairs like debris removal or traffic control. Those types of repairs are not included in the definition of repair and reconstruction for the purposes of this regulation. The evaluations under Part 667 would apply to all highways that are as defined in Title 23. It's those roadways that are open to the public. They must be eligible for financial assistance under Title 23, and highways with repair and reconstruction activities on 2 or more occasions due to emergency events. This evaluation excludes federally owned roadways, which would be tribally owned roads, and federally owned highways and bridges such as Park Service or Forest Service roadways. Those are not included in this regulation requirement. The regulation defines the following terms. I won't define each of these, I just discussed some of these, but catastrophic failure is basically a failure due to an external event, such as a truck crash into a bridge pier that might cause damage to that facility. Evaluation is defined. I briefly mentioned that. Emergency event is defined. That's a natural disaster or catastrophic failure that's declared by the governor or president as a major disaster or a governor declared event. Reasonable alternatives are defined as options that reduce future federal spending need by correcting the damages from possible future emergency events. Repair and reconstruction, I just mentioned that would be the permanent repair type work. And roads, highways, and bridges are as defined in Title 23, as I mentioned, eligible for federal assistance, but not the federally owned roadways. The data time period, availability, and data sources for Part 667 requirements are shown here. The beginning date for every evaluation under this part is January 1st of 1997. The end date is no earlier than December 31st of the year preceding the date on which the evaluation is due. Evaluation should cover a longer period if useful data is available from the state. DOTs must use any reasonable efforts to obtain this data, and DOTs may use any source or type of data useful to this evaluation to compile the evaluations. The timing of the evaluations under Part 667 depends on the type of roadway. Not later than November 23rd, 2018, this upcoming November, DOTs must complete their evaluations on NHS roads, highways, and bridges. And then 2 years from then, beginning on November 23rd, 2020, DOTs must prepare an evaluation for all other roads, highways, and bridges in the state, regardless of the ownership of those roadways, prior to including any project affecting those facilities in their statewide transportation plan. And a reevaluation is due every 4 years thereafter, or after an emergency event occurs in which the state would update their evaluation to add any roadways or bridges that were affected by an emergency, a declared emergency event. Consideration of these evaluations. DOTs must consider the results of an evaluation when developing their projects. These evaluations do tie into the asset management plans. DOTs must use these evaluations in the consideration of risks associated with their current and future environmental conditions as required in Part 515, the Transportation Asset Management Plan rulemaking or regulation requirement, as Steve mentioned. FHWA will periodically review DOT's compliance with this Part 667. This provision is independent of the ER program, the Emergency Relief Program, and is not a guarantee of ER eligibility. There's no separate funding here, and in fact, some of these facilities that are damaged by natural disaster or catastrophic failure may or may not actually be eligible under the ER program, so there's no funding tie to that. DOTs must make evaluations available to FHWA upon request, and FHWA may consider the results of these evaluations when making project development and other decisions. And that's a quick summary of Part 667. It's not a long rule, and I'm available for when we get into questions and answers for this session. If you have any, I'll be there to respond to that. And back to Jana.
All right, thank you, Greg. So that concludes the presentations for today. Thank you to all of our presenters for doing a fabulous job. So now we're going to move to the Q&A portion of the webinar. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A feature of the webinar toolbar, and I'm taking them in the order that people submit them. So we already have a set of questions in the queue, and our first question is for Steve. It's from Karen Miller, and she asks, PM2 and PM3 targets must be set on May 20th, 2018, then reported by October 1st, 2018 into the FHWA portal for Steve's comments on slide 4, but she wasn't sure if she misheard you, Steve, but she thought you said something different.
I did not
Steve?
say anything different.
Okay, so what she's stating is accurate. All right.
Am I correct, Mr. Grog?
Yes, the dates that Karen had were correct. So the states have to establish their targets by May 20th, but they will not report them till Federal Highway on our portal until October 1st.
All right. Our next question is from David Barrage, and he says, do we seek an extension to June 30th, 2019 to sync with the final TAMP? Steve?
Can you say the question one more time?
It says, do we seek an extension to June 30th, 2019 to sync with the final TAMP? So that's all it says, so that I don't...
Okay, I'll answer this question two ways. The due date in June 2019, there's no extension to that, okay? But could the state DOT submit a request for November 20th to take it out to June? I'll say this. The guidance memo that we should be providing to the division offices will clarify how that should be done.
Okay, so you
the
can't
guidance
share
memo
that
should
now,
come out in the next few months.
Okay, all right. All right, the next question is from Debbie Lehman. In what format will states be sending over their PM2 targets that are due May 20th, 2018? Does the state need to reference a submittal of the PM2 targets that are due after the TAMP is due? Steve?
I'll answer it from the asset management perspective, and I'll turn to Mac. As far as the asset management plan that's due on April 30th, the state DOT could include the state targets, and then they would still meet the other respective requirements of having it enter the portal on October 1st, or if the state DOT has not developed their targets yet, simply say that in the initial asset management plan. Max, you want to add
do you have something else to say?
Yeah, so as far as, and how the states will officially report those targets, so there is a portal, a website that is under development that should be available this fall, that every state DOT will have a person or persons who are designated to log into that, and they will then enter their targets on that website, you know, for the state of Connecticut or state of Iowa or state of California, whatever respective state they're at. And so that's how that will officially be reported as part of the transportation performance management. So essentially, and I guess, and I'll add a little bit on to what Steve was saying. So in the 2019 version that a state's going to have, and Steve, correct me if I'm wrong, but there they will have those targets because they will have been established and reported to Federal Highway. So the 2019 version of the TAMP will have those targets in the TAMP, correct?
Correct. And I just want to add one thing. Having those targets in the asset management plan is not a substitute for the other requirements, meaning entering it in the portal and so forth. You still need to do that.
All right. So the next question is from Imad Al-Hawi from Mississippi. Steve, for this, the TAMP must describe a methodology for obtaining necessary data from other NHS owners in a collaborative and coordinated effort. I think he's asking to validate that that is a correct statement.
Yes, that is a correct statement. So the expectation would be describing or just saying the state DOT has obtained data from Jackson County, or the state DOT has collected the data with their own equipment and has shared that information with the state, and they have sat down with the county or the local entities of other owners and discussed the data and discussed investment strategies, life cycle planning, risk, etc. Just describing what that collaboration coordination is.
I think he added a second entry next, which says, are you talking about the data management process? It sounds like you're not, right?
Am I talking about the pavement data quality plan, as he says that, asked that question?
No. So he's asking when you're saying describe a methodology for obtaining necessary data from other NHS owners in a collaborative and coordinated effort, are you talking about the data management process in that methodology? But it sounds like from your answer that you just gave, you're talking about more of the coordination collaboration process,
correct,
not the
correct,
data management process, right?
Correct.
Okay. So next question is also for you, Steve, from Matt Halbrecht. What is the status of getting more workshops? We were not one of the first 10 states, but we want the workshop. When will we find out when that will be available?
We plan on executing the I'll get into maybe more detail than Matt wants, but I'll give a complete answer. We plan on executing the option for that contract. I would expect that in the near future, and near future being days or weeks, not months. And we'll be in contact with Iowa and other respective states, I'll say in several weeks, and I would anticipate the workshop being available sometime after May 1st. So we're pretty booked out between now and then. Maybe it could squeeze in earlier, but you should hear something back from us in the next few weeks.
All right. So the next question is from Katie Zimmerman to you, Steve, also. In his presentation, Steve mentioned that the first consistency review will be conducted not later than August 31st, 2019. The text in the Federal Highways Process Certification Guidance states that no consistency determination will be made on the initial TAMP. And the first FHWA consistency determination will be made based on the state DOT's 2019 submission of a complete TAMP. Assuming the first fully compliant TAMP is submitted for review on June 30th, 2019, how can a state DOT demonstrate that they have implemented the fully compliant TAMP 2 months after the plan has been submitted? The FHWA's consistency guidance indicates the best evidence of plan implementation is based on the 12 months preceding the consistency determination. However, 12 months will not have passed before August 31st, 2019 deadline and the TAMP submittal date. To you, Steve.
We have a question and answer that addresses that, of the one that came out, I believe, in January, and it talks about, if we look at what was in the initial TAMP, and we realize that all the analyses may not have been done, and the state in 2019 should explain how the investment strategies, what was undertaken after the analysis was done and during that 1 year to follow the investment strategies in the initial TAMP. So the key point taken away is no consistency review is being undertaken in 2018. The consistency review will be undertaken in 2019. And if that, hopefully that question and answer, if I have a chance to pull it up while we take other questions, I will, and I'll highlight what question and answer addresses the item.
All right, our next question is from Helene Roberts, and this one's for you, Greg, and it's, what does evaluation mean under Part 667?
Under 667, the regulation defines that as it's the identification and consideration of these alternatives. It's considering the cost of future repairs under the current and future conditions environmentally, and it's goes on to talk about taking these considerations into the planning and project development process, and then further on in the rulemaking, it again talks about consideration of those evaluations, using them in their planning process, using them for these, they're required to be considered in the asset management plans. Now, we're going to get more guidance out on this shortly. We haven't put anything out yet, but our office will put something out, maybe some Q&As and a memorandum announcing the upcoming due date of these initial evaluations.
I wonder if I can jump in there with the item, Yana. I know we've had questions that if we acknowledge that the state DOTs may not have undertaken what I'll call the Part 667 analyses prior to April 30th, 2018, when the initial TAMP is due. However, the initial TAMP is required to describe the state processes of capturing the summary of the evaluation facilities that are repeatedly damaged. The initial TAMP should address how these facilities will, describe the process of how these facilities will be addressed in the risk analysis as required by 23 CFR 515.7 B and Z. I thought, if it has an impact on life cycle planning, address it. And if it has, but we know it has to be required in risk, has the state sat down and discussed how are they going to address these facilities that have been repeatedly damaged? It just describes that process.
All right, Steve, the next two questions from Helene Roberts are related. The first one is the November 20 date for submission of a fully compliant TAMP? And then the next related is, what is the level of detail needs to be in the TAMP by November 20th?
Like I mentioned earlier, states will be able to ask for an extension and work it out with the respective Federal Highway Division office with the expectation that it would take them to have a complete TAMP, and I'll tie back the date to the June 30th date, 2019. So it's recognized as very likely that state DOTs will not have a complete TAMP by November 20th. It's just what's in statute. But they need to have shown a good faith effort that they're working towards developing that first complete TAMP. And some indicators would be having their processes certified, they're working on it, they have their target set, etc.
Okay, the next question from Katie.
I'm going to answer that question one other way. What a complete TAMP is what is the expectation for what's in the June 30th TAMP.
Okay.
So if they can't have that meet all those requirements for the June 30th TAMP, then they would need to request an extension.
All right. The next question is for Greg from Katie Zimmerman. What documentation is required to demonstrate that a state DOT has conducted its evaluation of assets that have been damaged two or more times since 1997? Is it sufficient to say the evaluation was completed?
The evaluation would be more or less, and again, as I mentioned earlier, we'll be getting additional guidance out. We haven't put anything out on that yet, but it would be an identification or listing of those locations through determination of two or more locations that were damaged repeatedly. Exactly what that listing would look like, I don't know that we're going to be too prescriptive on telling the states here's what it must look like, but again, it's all tied to being able to use those evaluations to identify these sites and then use that in the planning process to mitigate or come up with reasonable alternatives to mitigate for future damages.
All right, Greg, the next one's for you as well. And this one's from Matt Hobrecht. Regarding Part 667, what if a project has already cleared NEPA and then a second emergency response event occurs before it has been added to the STIP? Do we need to go back to develop additional alternatives before programming in the STIP?
If the requirement is that if it's damaged on two or more occasions, and it's the same location, then that would be part of the evaluation. I don't know the requirement for the STIP particularly, but the evaluations and during the development of these should be considered during the development of the state's transportation plans. So if that site was damaged on two or more occasions, I mean, that's the requirement under Part 667, is that's when that consideration needs to be taken into account in their planning process, whatever that process is.
Greg, here's another one on the evaluation. So this one is from Bassi Onyal. It's in the evaluation definition under Part 667, it states that an analysis is required. Can you speak more on what level of analysis is required?
I don't know, and again, we'll be getting more detail out in the shortly on what that requirement is. So we haven't, with respect to 667, we haven't put anything out on that yet.
Okay.
And that'll be due in November. So we'll get something out soon, and then let our divisions know what these, in general, what those evaluations would require.
Okay. The next question is from Anne-Marie McDonald. Any suggestions or any states that have a good handle on how to coordinate the evaluations of the assets repeatedly requiring repairs with locals for all other roads, highways, and bridges, regardless of ownership by November 2020? I guess I would ask that of you, Greg and Steve, if you have suggestions also.
Yeah, I'll start. And so the question is, what are other states doing? And I'm not aware yet. I don't know that there's not a requirement on our part, on Federal Highway part, that there's any formal certification or submission of these on a regular basis to our headquarters office. So we'll be able to figure that out in the future when we see what states are doing. But I don't know that a lot have started that. Some may have, but this is a new rulemaking, and the due date hasn't approached yet. But as it does, maybe we can put together some kind of best practices site and try to compile that. Our office will be getting out some guidance shortly, but until then, we haven't provided anything on this yet.
And I'll just add to that, if we're talking about roads not owned by the state DOT, and I'm going to focus on NHS roads not owned by the state DOT, as the state is coordinating with other NHS owners, is ask, are they knowledgeable or aware of any of those NHS roads that have had repeated damage as stated in 667? It's as good a place to start as any if there's no other records from, state and declared emergencies, etc. Is there a record-keeping body somewhere in the state DOT that tracks state declared emergencies and related damage and so forth, as was described earlier?
All right. The next question is, it's a statement, and I think she's seeking your validation of the statement. This is from Helene Roberts, and the statement is, it looks like something additional is required between the initial TAMP and the fully compliant TAMP. Steve, do you want to take that one? So I think that's the November 20th.
Yes, and it seems like this November 20th has a lot more acknowledgement and recognition now that it's an actual date. But previously, it had language that talked about 18 months after, and at least I didn't have a good feel. So when is that? 18 months after the May 20th date, put it to November 20th. And the action needed is the state DOT needs to add, if they have not completed and implemented their first complete asset management plan, they need to request an extension from the Federal Highway Division office. And the Federal Highway Division office will be communicating to the state DOT what they need to do in late October or by November 1st or some date that there will be guidance coming out with regard to that specifically.
Okay. The next question is from Matt Hobrick. For Part 667 evaluations, how soon can we expect guidance regarding what documentation will be required in the NEPA 23 CFR 771 process?
For Part 667, I think we can expect something out from my office leadership within, maybe the next month.
Okay. The next one is from Helene Roberts. My state DOT addressed extreme events in its TAMP risk analysis, but has not done an evaluation of its assets. It will be very difficult to perform the evaluation in 6 months or less after guidance and Q&As are issued. Greg and Steve?
So the evaluation under 667, again, I don't know, I'm not clear what the question is. If we get some guidance out within, say, a month, and then the first evaluation would be due November, you know, I guess that's the deadline we need to shoot for.
This is Steve. As so in November, the state DOT will have completed the evaluation of facilities that have been repeatedly damaged. You have mentioned that in your state, you have already undertaken the risk analysis. The expectation would be, and I don't know how many of these facilities that have had repeated damage in your state. I'll say you want to pull in that you've done the analysis, describe what those facilities are, and as best you can, you know, coordinate with the Federal Highway Division office, see how you can best address those other items. We talk about what are the risks, what are the priorities, and what are mitigation strategies as best you can. And realize it's a shorter time frame of between November, when the TAMP is due, in June, that you may not complete as an extensive analysis as you will in the future, but I certainly think some analysis can be done. But coordinate with your Federal Highway Division office. And in fact, some of those NHS roads may already be identified as risk, seeing you recognize there've been emergency events there.
Our next question is from Sylvia Savenko, and the question is, if we have performance targets and evaluations for damaged facilities in separate documents or manual, can the TAMP reference those documents or manuals? This would be helpful to ensure the TAMP is up to date.
The TAMP would need to, it can reference other documents, that further information can be found there, but the TAMP should be able to stand on its own. With that meaning, it should address the items to the satisfaction of the Federal Highway Division office. So, you know, I know it may sound like a real bureaucrat here, but what do the regulations say? It talks about looking at the facilities that have been repeatedly damaged. It should indicate them and say, this is updated regularly. It can be found here and there, and do the ranking, prioritization, etc.
All right, our next question is from Chris Harris for Greg. If a slope failure occurred at a specific log mile or a route at one point in time, and then there is another failure of a different slope near that same log mile, not the same slope that was repaired previously, does this constitute a location requiring repetitive repairs?
Yeah, I don't know the specifics. I mean, that's hypothetical, and I think the best answer is to say we would have to look at something like that on a case-by-case basis. You know, we're not going to say if it's 100 feet apart, it's yes, or 101, it's no. But it sounds like it likely could be two separate incidents. But again, the key language in the regulation is about identifying an alternative that will mitigate the cause of the damage. So the question is the cause of the damage a similar cause, maybe a repeated weather pattern every year? And then are there alternatives, reasonable alternatives that could address that a single alternative that could address both of those slope failures? Then in that case, that alternative should be what is included in the planning process to address that. And so both of those certainly should be looked at. But technically, is it one location repeatedly damaged, or are they two different locations? I would look at the possibility of a reasonable alternative that could address both, or reasonable alternatives that are needed separately in that case.
And I'm going to add to that. I'm going to say Greg responded to that from the Part 667 perspective. And I don't know if Chris would also like a response from the Part 515 perspective, the asset management plan. If I'm looking at, hypothetically, Route 50, and you had the slope at the 1 mile marker, and you had it at the 2, 3, or 5 mile marker, and that's an NHS route, I'll use the word expect. I'm not using a shall or a should. I would expect the state DOT, from the perspective of looking at the performance of Route 50 or the NHS, that if this is really affecting the performance of the NHS, alternate route in the performance of the network, they should certainly consider including it in the TAMP. You know, I've heard of a couple cases where there were major slope failures, and for several months there were detours that were 50, 100 miles or more. And if that's affecting, I'll go as far as to say, the economy of the region, and if that's important to the state, which would mean X amount of resource allocation that should be captured, or if it came down to a decision of, do I put, and I'm using a unsophisticated term here, do I pave more roads, put a more blacktop, or do we got to fix that slope because it's really affecting carrying traffic and the detour is really bad? Yeah, you may want to consider that in your asset management plan, because from a state perspective, it's important in keeping the assets in a state of good repair, improving or preserving the condition of the assets and the performance of the network perspective.
Thanks, guys. So the next,
and let me give a quick answer. Excuse me there, Yannick. I see, looking at the clock here, I mentioned earlier, I believe there was a question about the consistency determination and when it shall be done. There is an answer in it's question and answer number 14 on the question and answers that are available on the Federal Highway Asset Management website that was revised and supplemented as of January 24, 2018. It's question 14. But I'm going to answer the question directly from the regulation from 515.13. The question was basically, what year will the first consistency determination take place? Is it 18? Is it 19? Is it 20? 515.13B, annual determination of consistency under 23 U.S.C. 119E5, not later than August 31, 2019, and not later than July 31 in each year thereafter. Federal Highway will notify the state whether the state DOT has developed and implemented an asset management plan consistent with 23 U.S.C. 119. I say that recognizing that implemented is the consistency determination action. Back to you, Yana.
All right, the next suggestion is from Karen Miller. Please ensure any federal highway guidance and state DOT best practices is posted on the FHWA TPM website and the AASHTO TAM website so we can easily find it. And I'm guessing, Steve, you're going to say that to add to that, to look at the FHWA asset management website, correct?
Yep. All the guidance and there's links from the Federal Highway TPM website. But go to the FHWA Asset Management website. On the top bar, it says guidance. Everything is there.
All right. And for our final question, we're just over time, but this is the last one. This is from Chris Harris. For Greg, if guidance on Part 667 is forthcoming soon, will it be available prior to the deadline for the initial TAMP, April 30 this year? Since that's not identified as a section that is excluded from the initial TAMP.
The 667 guidance, I can't say that it will be ready by then, perhaps, but the requirement for 667 evaluations and the regulation, that deadline isn't until November. So even if we have guidance out, you're not going to have necessarily, states won't necessarily have their 667 evaluations done in time for the April requirement under the TAMP, and I'll let maybe Steve can address that further. But I believe what he mentioned in the webinar was to do with the consideration of planning for 667 evaluations, not necessarily a final evaluation at that point, because again, the April deadline is before the 667 deadline in November.
Yes, the requirement for the initial asset management plan, which is due on April 30th, is the state DOT would describe their processes related to risk, but this is one of the requirements of how this, when you do have that evaluation data, what is the process and how it will be considered, etc. It's recognized that the analysis quite possibly will not be done because you quite possibly have not undertaken the evaluation yet, but you're still required to describe the process.
All right. Thank you, everyone. We went a few minutes over. I just want to say that the next webinar is on Wednesday, April 11th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time. And while we don't have a topic for it yet, maybe a good one will be on Part 667, given the range of questions and uncertainty and the timing of the guidance. So we'll send out a notice through Match shortly on the topic, but we hope you'll be able to join us, and thank you all, and thank you to our presenters today. See you in April. Goodbye.
Thank you, everybody.